Hello, friends. Good morning or good evening, depending on your time zone. Today we're looking at 3 issues and then the remaining backlog. We start with one that was yesterday discussed on Twitter. I made a I made a bad joke. In case you didn't know, Twitter was hacked yesterday, and I made a joke that we will give out APIs for free, and then somebody, of course, mentioned one API that we haven't looked at in a long time, and then discussion endured, and so I ended up marking this as let's look at this today. So it's a relatively easy API. We already have some of the async APIs we added to the file class. Originally, we didn't do anything that, either where the granularity was not big enough or, where it didn't make much sense, like the IEnumerable one, for example. And so now that we have iAsync enumerable, one proposal is to actually add read lines async, where you effectively stream the contents of the file as an iAsync enumerable, right? So the API shape seems, as far as I can tell, like somewhat reasonable. But I'm curious what other people are thinking. I guess you can't see the screen, right? Can you? Let me share the screen. I was also kind of confused because my CPU time wasn't bad today. That should have given it away that I'm not sharing my screen. People on Twitter on YouTube can see it, but yeah, so now I have to open up Teams again. Here we go. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Something async suffix.
Yeah, sorry, I was
No, I was making a jab at you blocking async suffix from your Twitter.
Yeah, I did that because people were complaining to me for the 100th time that why is the VCL telling me to suffix my method names with async?
Read the book.
Yeah, unfortunately the book now is like 800 pages or something.
All my copies are upstairs.
I should probably blog about it. Do a Jared Parsons style blog where it's like, you're all wrong and here's why. Move on. All right, so... Oh my god, is that the... Oh my god, this is the... Jesus Christ, you already have it in physical form, Jeremy. That's amazing.
I've got my physical copy too, but it's in a box yet unpacked from the move.
Damn.
Yeah, I got my author copies yesterday, so Jeremy and Tanner both beat me to having a copy of the book.
Fuck me. Everybody who who contributed content gets a copy for free, right? Is that the deal?
If your name is Christoph Swolina, Jeremy Barton, or Brad Abrams, yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Especially Brad, I think, wrote a lot of content for this release. Anyway, so let's talk about this one then. So any objections to this API?
No. Speaking of somebody that was in System.io for not too long ago.
Yeah, the only feedback I had on this was I wanted to make sure that it was following the patterns that we had established for async enumerable, such as where how the cancellation token gets flowed, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so that was a change that we made, I think, very late, that we said APIs can't take a cancellation token to tag async enumerable, right? I think originally we only said use the extension method, right?
So the iAsync enumerable, the cancellation token parameters should have an attribute applied, enumerator cancellation.
Interesting.
And then that tells the compiler when it's building the state machine that it can, if it knows that default was passed in, it doesn't need to do a cancellation token combine, and if it otherwise it does need to merge the call to move next async cancellation token with the one that was passed in here.
Okay, so
it's on page 362 of a wonderful book that I have a digital copy of in front of me.
So hold on, let me actually remove some of the fully qualified names so we can actually see what the heck is going on here. And so basically, so the attribute is applied to the parameter?
Yes.
And the name was?
enumerator cancellation.
Remind me how many else? 2?
Yeah.
And so we also said both of them are defaulted, right? The both cancellation tokens. Yep. And then encoding it's not. All right. That would work for me.
Yeah, I mean, we could collapse those down because assuming that the existing read lines that takes an encoding accepts null as if the other overload was called, we could do defaults, but then we'd hit the 2 or more defaults rule and want to make a simpler one anyway. It's
Did we say so we only accept one optional one? Is that what is that or?
Well, we have the rule of once you have 2 or more defaults, then consider adding a simpler thing that doesn't use defaults, but then always add one back for cancellation token. So we would end up at approximately this anyway, or we'd say that the 2 don't count cancellation token. But
yeah, I mean, like, how do we feel about, generally speaking, optional parameters when the existing overloads all have overloads for those? We just keep doing overloads? I think so, right?
I feel that if there were like 5 different overloads that we could express with one simple one and one optional parameters, that's all we would do. Doing 2 here seems reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, the encoding one seems also extremely rare. I mean, I think I've never ever used this one. I mean, I wouldn't say
How
super
else are you
rare.
going to do UTF-7?
Exactly. Like, my text files are written with a modern editor, so I don't do UTF-7.
Yeah. So the guidelines, just since we haven't added many of these, just walking through them, it has the suffix async, add the enumerator cancellation attribute to the cancellation token, don't return async enumerator, and this is not, it's enumerable, and don't be both an enumerator and enumerable on a public type, and this isn't adding a public type, so I think we're good. Once we add the attribute, the parameter attribute.
What does the attribute do again? It's just the way the compiler passes it through?
Yeah, it changes how so in the await for each, there's you can optionally bind a cancellation token on each call to move next. And then if a cancellation token is provided here, it knows how to merge them together, and it only understands that they're related if you put the attribute on it.
But was that for the implementation of readlines async, or was that for the consumption? I thought I thought it was for the implementation when you use yield return. So it may not actually matter.
Oh yes, that is do add it if it's using yield return. I don't know how that behaves with the ref set. If it's only the implementation, then the ref may not need it.
Yeah, then let's strip it for now, and then just say it in the comment.
The last 3 words were using yield return.
Yeah.
That's what I get for skimming.
All right, so then that was easy. 1 down. The WinForms one.
So, you want me to talk to it?
Probably, because I don't know what this is about.
Just don't want to assume anything. So, the gist of this is that like what instigated it is that like there's a working on optimizing the painting in WinForms, and we start in WinForms. It's typically through a Windows message, and that means we have an HDC that we're getting back from Windows. and there's a fair amount of optimization or attempted optimization internally where we try to stick with the HTC. But once a graphics has been obtained from it, then we kind of have to use that. And there's, as the model for WinForms is built on System Drawing or GDI Plus, a great deal of the infrastructure and public API, I mean, most of the public API, except for the most recent stuff, uses graphics as its main interface. We don't have a way to abstract these things together as they go through the pipeline in WinForms. Graphics itself implements iDevice context, which actually gets you the HTC back out of it. And all of the painting args that we have are actually a one-to-one thing with a graphics object. And if the painting args themselves derive from iDevice context, that would allow a couple of things. It would allow, as far as WinForms itself, we can smuggle the paint event args through without having to box them into an iDevice context instance. And for users, they can pass them back into our iDevice context APIs that we have that are a little bit more recent. And when we get them back in the other side, we'd be able to tell whether or not we can apply the speed optimizations to it, i.e., like not create the graphics object if we don't have to. And we're also tracking now whether the graphics object has ever been obtained through the event args through the public interface. So that's what the gist is.
So this is an existing interface and the existing types. You just want to say that they adhere to the interface, and your sample here, you have them being implemented explicitly.
Yes, because the idea here is that we don't. It's distracting that they're there, and just don't want them hanging off publicly. If you really want to go and get it that way, it doesn't buy you anything. But when you get an HTC off of a graphics object itself or through this, it locks the graphics object. And as such, just don't want it hanging out in front of things.
So, but I get this right? User code doesn't deal with the interface at all. It's just for your own plumbing, right?
It's for our own plumbing, but it allows them to pass it back through again through our own public APIs, but beyond just what we're doing internally. So they're doing users effectively doing what we do internally, or I'm trying to do internally, without having to know anything about it. And because that's already implemented by graphics, it seems to be a reasonable way to do this, rather than trying to go introduce something new into system drawing.
Right. So that whole interface is essentially just infrastructure.
Yep. It was all infrastructure to begin with, really. It is useful for end users to use it, but it was put in there to begin with for the whole WinForms thing. Is that you to want to unwrap the native HTC out of it again?
Yeah, it seems it's odd that it was public to begin with, but yeah, I mean, it seems fine to me. I mean, it seems like, generally speaking, something that has about as least of an API impact as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just scrolling through the stuff we have for guidance on explicit implementations. Is there an expectation of needing to call these members from a derived type? I assume they're unsealed just because the guidelines say be unsealed, and that there's no real expectation of inheritance on these types.
There is some inheritance on the types that's going on internally, but users could smuggle their own stuff as well by deriving, so it is possible.
Because
it was not really I don't think it was really a design goal that they be unsealed, but
yeah. So there's the did we call it a do? Yeah. Provide a protected virtual member that offers the same functionality as the explicitly implemented member if the functionality is meant to be specialized by derived classes. So
Yeah, and this functionality really,
just is what it is. So okay, seems reasonable to me. If it bothers someone later that they're explicitly implemented, we can undo that.
Yeah, I think it seems totally fine to me.
Yeah, I don't think I would do it for the draw item event args dispose, but I'm on the fence. So
do what on it? Oh, and make it explicit.
yeah, explicit dispose.
So yeah, that one I don't care as much
the
about.
world.
It's just if we do, I guess if we do it without the explicit dispose, the question would be is whether or not we need to follow the other pattern of making it protected and overridable when they do derive from it, because that's what the existing paint event args does, because that one actually already does iDisposable.
I mean, you should. Your dispose. Essentially, you'd register the dispose and the dispose bool, and then your dispose bool is going to do nothing. And
yeah.
Yeah, I would do the dispose publicly according to the pattern for unsealed types, but
Okay.
the parts that are just iDevice context being explicitly implemented seems fine.
All right. So dispose with the normal pattern public as far as being protected and protected virtual for the one that takes the bool.
Yep.
All right.
And I assume these are here just as representative examples, and it is really all the types in the bulleted list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Those were the primary ones I'm working with right now. That I wanted to get the whole bucket list of these are all the ones that actually do wrap a graphics object.
Yep.
And
so
I will apply them as I work through this.
Right. Seems reasonable to me, given with the comments already given.
So basically what we said is dispose, but they should all be, because most of them are unsealed, they should also follow the dispose pattern, right? With
the ones that were not already disposable should do dispose according to the dispose pattern and public.
Assuming the class is unsealed, right?
Yeah, if the class is sealed.
I didn't triple check those. I think they're all unsealed, but some of those might not be. Some of those might be sealed.
Yeah, if there's a sealed one, then I don't have an opinion as to whether it's public dispose or explicit dispose.
Okay. Makes sense to me.
Alright, so that means, hold on, copy paste pasta. If I can get my machine to cooperate again. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Here we go. Alright, so I assume that makes sense to people. Probably should have edited it.
Now it looks reasonable.
Awesome. All right. And this was that. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks.
All right. So, with the specific APIs, we reviewed this last time. There were a lot of changes afterwards and lots of feedback on particulars. So I want to just quickly go over the changes at the high level thing, and then I would hope we can just mark this as approved. So the two things we talked about high level wise was when I made that list, I assumed that all of these APIs ship in box. There's some assemblies that we have shipped as part of the Windows Compat pack, which means they're effectively out-of-band NuGet packages available for Net Standard 2.0. And we concluded that we should also mark them, and the way we would do this is we just have an internal attribute definition that ships inside of these assemblies, because the analyzer doesn't care. It just cares about the name, and it doesn't care whether it's public, it just cares about the name that is applied. And so it will just work without polluting the namespace. The other thing we talked about was partially supported APIs. So some of the APIs we had in this list work, generally speaking, but it depends on the attribute on the actual combination of parameters. So for example, named pipes don't actually work when you specify a name for the pipe. And so they work cross-platform so long you set name to null. And so we said, well, that's sad, but we want to minimize number of false positives for these analyzers, so we basically will not mark these APIs at all. And if that becomes a problem, then later on we can add a custom analyzer that particularly checks for combination where it can prove that you pass non-null values to the name, and then we will actually mark the API accordingly, or flag the API usage, I guess, accordingly. There's a few open issues, so I reran all the data that all the API list that I presented here was taken from the Platform Compat tool that we shipped several years ago as an out-of-band NuGet package, and I have updated this with rerunning effectively the scanner for platform not supported exceptions against, I want to say, preview 6 of basically whatever the latest version is that's available as of 3 days ago. And so basically the gist is I only found one case where an API wasn't recognized as platform not supported, but basically no other changes were done. And so it's possible that in preview 7 we have more changes, so we should probably rerun this tool a few more times, maybe make changes to the code base, but I don't expect major churn for this. The other thing we talked about was we don't have a way to support annotations along the lines of this API doesn't work on a particular platform. The whole design is predicated on we mark where things work. And so basically, as soon as we do that, then everything we haven't marked is assumed to not be supported. And so like we need to change the analyzer or change the design to allow for this attribute, but that's outside the scope of the spec because this is only really for Windows-specific APIs. So the only thing we have to say is this works only on Windows. This doesn't handle cases like OpenSSL where it's like, oh, this doesn't work on Windows. But it's a separate feature. And that was pretty much most of it. So the only open issue that I have is threading overlapped for the assemblies themselves. My understanding was that overlapped I/O was a Windows-only feature, but I couldn't find an implementation any reason why it wouldn't work. But I'm also not an expert, so that's why I left it like this. Probably Steven or whoever is the champion of threading these days has to take a look at that. Then specific APIs, I mean, I think most of the thing was just individual feedback for area owners. So here's an example where we basically we didn't mark the API, we just marked enum members that are passed to the API. So that addresses most of those concerns. And then there was some crypto feedback and then some additional stuff that was, I think Adam looked over that and found some additional cases. The only thing pending really is WCF, so I pinged the WCF folks to take a look at this. So we'll probably add a few more APIs for that, but my goal isn't necessarily to bring every single API to this review board because it's probably not super useful. I just want to establish kind of the case law that we have, and I think we have done that at this point. Is there any more feedback or concerns with this approach? Or questions for that matter?
I have a question about, so at the top you have that the attribute is Windows all the way to the S 7.0.
Yep.
Is that actually the identifier or is it Win 7.0?
I believe we landed on Windows. The
Okay,
basically,
'cause
so
I thought the RID was just win.
yeah, okay, so this is where it gets interesting. So this is not the RID. This is the part of the TFM that is not the framework.
Okay.
So when you say net5-Windows 7.0, I mean, most of the time you will never say a version number with Windows when you specify it in the TFM, but we have rules on what that means, and so when an assembly is being generated, it will put in the version number, that whatever the SDK's version number of that build of that version of the TFM is, right? So in our case, for .NET 5, net5-Windows really means net5-Windows 7.0.
So does your scheme handle all of the Windows 10 versions, the individual releases?
So it will, I mean, like, it's a typical 4-digit version number here, right? So like any version number that Windows has can be expressed. We cannot express things like build numbers or any other parts of Semver because they don't make sense for ordering, right? Because we use this thing to determine can an API be called, right? So we have to be able to say less than or equals to, right?
Sure. So you can specify that it's the spring update or the fall update.
Right, but you wouldn't say -spring update, you would say whatever the version number that is.
10.0.2004?
Yeah, something like that, whatever the thing is.
All right.
And given that it's a string, it's not even constrained to be the, what is it, I think an int16, I guess. But we will probably not see this because usually these version numbers end up in something like a system.version where the constraint exists. All right, then, given that there's not more to talk about, then I will just mark this as approved and then move on with live.
I concur. By the way, regarding the Win versus Windows moniker from earlier, does it make sense to have an analyzer? Or, I mean, this is an analyzer that's looking at all of this, but does it make sense for the analyzer to give a warning saying, like, I really don't understand what you're passing in here? Like, this is a moniker that is unknown to me.
Are you asking about invalid strings for the minimum OS platform?
Yes, something. I know that there is a scenario where people want to be able to specify their own custom strings, but I wonder if by default the analyzer should suggest, like, hey, you passed in something that I'm not aware of. Was this a typo?
Oh,
like
so one thing that we talked about is you will validate that the syntax is correct, right? So that you don't say Windows 7.0, but you say Windows 7.0. And that you have a dot in there, right? So that you can't say Windows 7.0, you have to say Windows .0. But like the one thing we haven't talked about was constraining the actual OS names to a noun set. We have talked about this in the context of the TFMs, where we said we should enforce this during the build, that, you know, third parties can't extend the OS suffix. I'm not sure we want to do this with the analyzer, but I do buy the scenario that if you misspelled it, it's most likely a typo. That is certainly something we could consider. Because you're right, we would expect people to put them as literals in source, right? They will most likely not use a literal in the attribute application. They will probably define a literal somewhere in their assembly and then refer to that constant, but it would still be nice if you could validate that the string makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we can put a list of known things in the analyzer, and if it's not in the list, it'll be a distinct diagnostic. So anybody who's working on standing up a new platform would just disable that diagnostic.
Yeah, and probably also just submit a PR to the known list.
Yep.
Let me add this as feedback.
Yeah, even if we didn't want to warn on all unknown things, if we could at least do something like say, oh, you typed in Win, you probably meant Windows. Like if we can at least seed a potentially known common misspellings type thing.
Now you want to be fancy.
Well, it does match, what we've done elsewhere in .NET and Visual Studio, where we try to, hold your hand if we think we know what you're trying to do. I mean, it's not worth rat holing on. It's just, feedback, EMS capturing it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'll follow up on that one. Nice. All right, so that one is done then. Now let me take a look at my other tool that I have to actually just filter down the milestones, which is sadly not a website, so my CPU is busy launching a process. And here it is. So we just look at everything that is in the 5.0 milestone. And that would put us for these types. And of course, it opens in the wrong browser window, but that's fine. All right, here are a few. Tanner, is this ready?
Yes, should be. So the premise of this issue is that there exists the long type in C and C++, which doesn't correctly translate to any particular type in .NET. In particular, on Windows, it is always a 32-bit integer, whereas on Unix systems, it is a platform-sized integer. So it's 32 bits on a 32-bit system and 64 bits on a 64-bit system. In order to correctly define that, you need to build architecture-dependent or RID-specific libraries and figure out how to distribute them, which we don't necessarily have a good story for today, for external customers to use. And so the proposal here is basically, since we already have an existing system to distribute RID-specific binaries, specifically corelib, for example, and because this is a core type that people commonly need for interop scenarios, we should just expose these new types as part of system runtime interop services for people to use. Additionally, one of the other issues that comes up, and one of the reasons why it needs to be in corelib in particular, is that a simple wrapper struct and a primitive type are not treated the same for all calling conventions or ABI scenarios. For example, with instance members on Windows, struct returns are returned by pointer in a return buffer rather than passed in register. And so the runtime would be able to specially handle these structs to ensure they get passed correctly as if they were a primitive type rather than a struct wrapper.
Right. So the marshaller and everything is going to special case these the same way it does intpitter. I guess intpitter is probably not even special cased, but they will be special cased. So if you're running on Windows, C-long will pack only as 32 bits.
Right.
Okay.
So a related question, Tanner. Say that I'm on Windows and I'm not using interop, I'm just using this type directly for some bizarre reason. And I construct a CU long around newint.maxValue. What value will I read when I query the value property getter?
I believe we'd throw on construction with overflow.
Okay, so the constructor will validate.
Right. These types aren't meant to be more generally usable, so you won't get operators or things like that. They're meant to basically be the bare minimum wrapper type to ensure marshalling happens correctly and to avoid scenarios where, for example, you have a struct that contains an array of structs that contain these fields, and so you have to marshal each individual struct to get things to work correctly. So users will just create it using the constructor, set it, and then marshalling will work as expected. They can retrieve the value out, but they'll have to manually truncate themselves when they retrieve it out. And then on set, it will validate that you are not overflowing the size limit.
Okay, so that also means that marshal.size of on Windows of CU long will be 4, correct? Always.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
So one thing that I believe we talked about in the past, but I'm not sure why we rejected this, is like at some point I think somebody said, why do we need types for this at all? Wouldn't this be just attributes that you put on the field and says marshal as, whatever it is, C long, CU long, but you would still define them as effectively the larger type?
You could do that. There was a fairly lengthy discussion on this and a related issue. Jan's also on the call, so maybe he can comment a bit more. But the general thing is we don't want to continue adding specialized attributes in the runtime because they can be very error prone. And another scenario is it does add marshalling overhead, which can be quite expensive in some cases, because you actually have to allocate a separate buffer, convert everything in size, perform actual marshalling rather than just letting it blit across the boundary.
Gotcha. And I guess related then to this is the expectation is if I define a struct, I will basically use C long and CU long directly. And then my actual user types that I expose or consume will pretty much never use C long and CU long because they're close to unusable, right? They don't have any arithmetic on them. So I will always have to convert them. Should we at least have implicit conversions though?
I mean, for something like C long, we could only implicit in int. We can't implicit in long because that would be an overflow on Windows.
Right.
And so it just feels like maybe it's not worth it. As long as int implicitly goes to inint, then you don't have to double cast or you don't have to explicitly write a double convert in the constructor. Yeah.
And if people do request operators or conversion support, then it could be discussed in the future. But I don't think those are strictly necessary now. It should be enough that users are able to just
define them.
Or use unsafe as to cast and such they know that it's safe.
Like I guess my question is like, how do you see a public API around those? Do you think people would basically just use int because they have to assume that they run on int32 based platforms, or is the expectation that they literally exploit the fact that they could be 32-bit or 64-bit and then effectively use inptr and then just on Windows say, sorry?
My general expectation is that people don't use these in public API. They use these behind the scenes for interrupt scenarios. And then for C long, they would likely expose it as inint publicly. And if they had a setter, they would do the validation internally, or they just decide I only accept int, and they would also truncate on Unix.
Yeah, I guess I understand that you don't use these types as public API. That's why I'm asking. Like, I guess it depends on the feature, right? In many cases, you don't have a corresponding int value in your public API because it's only part of the plumbing you have to do to call the underlying API, right? But I would assume that there will be cases where you would do that, and then I guess my question is, what type do we expect them to use in that space? And I guess it will be int because that's the thing that works everywhere.
I mean, I think it would probably depend on context a lot. Like if you're taking something as input and putting it in one of these structs to pass to an OS function, you might be okay with limiting yourself to, even just int, or int32, and but if it's output, then you probably need to express it as the bigger type, because you don't want to like call the function it works and then you're like, oh, I can't tell you what the answer is because it's too big.
I guess that's also
Right.
true. Yeah.
Right. That's why it's exposed here as inint rather than as, for example, separate int and inint. Inint is always big enough to hold the type on the platforms currently supported.
Right.
And so you might just get a type that's bigger than necessary on Windows as the value you're reading out. But internally, it will still be an int, just a 32-bit int.
Is there any value in having a public static read-only size on these, or should we just make someone do marshal.sizeof if they care?
I think doing marshal.sizeof or just size of would be reasonable.
Sizeof would have to be unsafe, but yeah.
Yeah, but you're only meant to use this in unsafe context, so interrupt scenarios, that is.
Right, but to use the size of keyword on a type, that's an explicit list. Otherwise, it needs to be in an unsafe block.
Right.
So,
is there any language required for those?
No. So these would not be language recognized at all. There'd be no literal support, no planned literal support or anything else. I think it would be a terrible addition to C# to have a compatible C long type.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, as just a marshalling aid, this seems nice, especially on the systems that vary between the processor architectures for the OS.
The third one, notably infloat, is a native-sized float. It's largely just for Apple hardware, as they have their own native float type, which is 32-bit. It's a single on 32-bit systems and a double on 64-bit systems.
But they're moving away from it, right?
Well, it's being moved away from in that they're dropping support for 32-bit on basically everything except for their watches and a few other bits.
Yeah, I think somebody commented and says, is nfloat confusing to anyone else since it holds a double? I mean, well, it holds a single or a float, right? Sorry, the single or double depending on where you run.
Right.
So
and then we expose it as a double because that's the largest size.
Is there any reasonable caution that you can anticipate that it would need to go to quad?
I don't believe so, considering that it's platform sized. If there is, then I imagine there'd be a lot more support needed both in .NET and in, for example, the language, the runtime, and everything else to support that.
Yeah, and this uses the letter N because it's talking about a hardware thing. This isn't corresponding to any keyword in the C language.
Correct. This one is infloat because Apple calls it infloat. It's also because it matches up with inint and inuint. It's just native sized float.
Yeah. Should we also have constructors that take the smaller inputs, or do we not care?
I was actually going to suggest that because it's if the regular constructors validate, then taking the smaller inputs will always work without validation across all platforms.
Yeah.
That seems reasonable to me.
Right, so C-long would get int32, CU-long would get uint32, and infloat would get float.
Yes.
Is it even possible to call a float constructor if a double overload exists?
Yes, float's preferred over double.
Yep.
Okay.
Which is also why we had to create mathf.
Yep.
We have
exact
sane
type
rules.
match beats any inference. Even special math inference.
Oh, and sorry, I misspoke earlier. Apple calls it CG float, not infloat.
CG?
Yep, CG float for
It's a-
core graphics float.
It's a garbage
I was
collector.
gonna say, if it was CF float, I'd know it was from Core Foundation, but what's the G? I guess they expect it for people doing things on GPUs.
The N prefix seems like it would still work because, as was mentioned earlier, N int new int. It also matches what Mono already shipped, I think.
Right. Well, I mean, it is a little weird because I guess I don't know how big a floating point register is on, a 486. Are they 32-bit registers? And
They're
then
80-bit registers
ooh,
because the by 87 FPU unit, and on modern hardware they're technically 128 bits, but they actually subsected into properly sized scalars.
So I mean, it really is just the question of, like when we say the int, we're saying that this is the size of a integer value register, and is in float. If in float is really about like Apple marshalling some things onto a graphics subunit, then that feels like maybe we're not doing the right thing. But
Well, it's not in as an integer sized, it's in for native.
right, but it's not the native. It's not really the native float, because at that point it seems like they might have two different floating points if they call it the CG float versus.
Well, in as in platform bitness.
Yeah.
So you might have bigger registers available on your hardware, but the hardware native size is 32 versus 64.
But you said this is only going to change on Apple.
Yeah, it's not.
Well,
it's not a platform.
So infloat only exists as a concept on Apple, but we just make it float everywhere on a 32-bit system and double everywhere on a 64-bit system.
Okay, so we're going to say this is the CPU size,
right?
Even if that doesn't necessarily have a semantic meaning to the platform you're on.
Correct, because
Okay.
that's all that it is for Apple.
Okay, that makes a whole lot more sense. I thought that you were saying it was only going to be 32-bit on 32-bit Apple systems. So, no. Okay. Now I'm happier with it.
I see, but that is different from C long and CU long, right?
That's why it doesn't start with C.
Whereas those are the C long and the C unsigned long type.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that still holds up. Like, yeah. Okay, some new ones there. All right, then I guess this is it then for this one.
I think the only other note is Xamarin called out that they wouldn't be able to use these types because one, they define their own types that are in the system namespace that are all lowercase named, and we wouldn't be exposing those there, and also it would there'd likely be some minor incompatibilities because they expose, for example, full operator support on their types, etc. But you would be able to unsafe as between these types for interop scenarios.
I was about to ask, like, if that is that the long-term plan then, that Xamarin will always have these types defined in the system namespace and we don't?
I don't know. That also applies to inint, for example, and I'm not sure what the story is there. They define system inint, which conflicts with the inint keyword, and they do behave differently, and they are different types in the type system. So that's probably a longer discussion to have with Merrick and Marcus and others.
All right, so then I guess this is it for now. I think Jeremy has to talk to this one.
Sure. So, starting with Net 4.6 and all of .NET Core, we've had type-specific accessor methods for getting a hold of public and private keys off of certificates. So we have, get RSA public key, get ECDSA public key, etc. Certificates can represent an EC-Diffie-Hellman key, and we don't have a get EC-Diffie-Hellman public key or get EC-Diffie-Hellman private key. People can usually work around this by getting it as ECDSA and then grabbing the native handle or exporting the parameters. And there's a bunch of work that they have to do when it comes up. It sort of rarely comes up, which is why it hadn't been done before, but somebody finally asked for it. So this is just taking the pattern we have for the other 3 asymmetric algorithm types. This is the 4th, and it extends it to the 4th one.
Are there other classes that would need the same thing?
No, we only have 4 types that derive from asymmetric algorithm. So this is the 4th of 4.
And is there any reason why we make them extension methods rather than just redefining them on certificate 2?
The others are extension methods because the implementations lived in system.core and the certificate class lived in system. So the others were extension methods because of framework, and now these would be extension methods because of pattern.
Yeah, my only concern with that is like, let's say this is, there's like 6 more types like that. And we start when we only had 1 type of prior art, and now everybody copies the bad prior art. But like, it seems if we only have 1 type, then that's fine probably. But maybe it's worthwhile breaking with that and just say, screw it, we actually put them as instance methods to make our lives easier. Like, I don't know how much, like, it seems generally sad to add a new type just to hold extension methods. Especially when you have to play tricks in implementation because you actually need some private state to actually implement them.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly make these be proper instance methods. The question is, would we then also take the existing extension methods, copy them as instance methods, and then effectively be deprecating the extensions? Or leave the 3 types that are already there the way they are and only new things going forward when we get around to supporting PQC algorithms. I assume post-quantum is going to be the next thing that we bother ever adding. So.
Yeah, so... Because then I would...
It really, yeah, so the instance versus extension is just about the 3 that we have right now are all extension because of .NET Framework limitations. This one would be... do we start a new pattern? Do we start a new pattern that we want to unify? Or do we just maintain the existing pattern?
I mean, in general, like I like the guideline to say, make things extension methods only when you have to. Don't make them just because, right? And these ones don't strike me as they make sense of extension methods. I mean, just because we did this in full framework, as you said, that was for layering reasons or because we wanted to OOP them or some other constraints, right, that may not apply.
Yeah, it was layering, so we didn't have to move X509 certificate 2 out to core or move all of CNG into system. But yeah, so it was definitely layering in framework, and like I can tell you the implementation of copy with private key is it calls an internal method on certificate called copy with private key. Like all these extension methods just forward to internal instance methods because we do need this state. Yeah,
that's why I'm not a fan of extension methods, because it's like, oh, yeah, of course now you have the methods in 2 places because why not? Yeah, then let's just make them regular instance members.
Yeah.
Like I'm not too concerned with the pattern because the usage side is effectively the same no matter what. It's just cleaner for us, and it's less noise in the namespace because we don't have to add a type to hold them.
Fair enough. And then so do we want to, at the same time that we're adding these as instance members, backform and add instance members for the existing algorithms, so there's technically a duplicate, but the instance will beat the extension? The extension types we can't remove because they're required by net standards.
Yeah, I mean, like we have not done this either. I think for the networking stack, where we added the async ones as extensions. I mean, I guess I don't know whether the state is. I guess in the other ones they actually are extension methods, right? For real, they're not actually instance members. But like in the WebSocket, what was it, WebSocket or Socket, or I forgot which API that is, where we added the async methods as extensions. They always shipped with actually being instance members, and the extension was just forwarded to them. And like in that point, we could have just made them public. But I think we didn't end up doing it because it would have been weird to just have two APIs in two places now. I mean, unless there is a reason, I would probably not change the existing ones. I would just leave them as is.
Okay. I'm just asking the questions.
Yeah, as Emo said, like we actually did something like that in the reflection stack a few years ago, and having two methods effectively with the same name, one instance, one extension, ended up being really confusing.
Okay, and then the other thing buried in it that I forgot was attached to this one, but hey, it's good. It means I don't have to bring it up when we talk about possibly the next issue. Is we have this class called public key. So from a certificate, you can get a thing talking about its public key. It doesn't actually the public key. It's just information about it. And in a previous version of .NET Core, we started adding these import and export methods for the file formats that are common to those types. And a public key, its export type is called subject public key info. And so this is adding the ability to create it from, or the ability to just export that same pattern that we have on like RSA and DSA and such.
So we add a constructor that basically just takes the algorithm, and then the first one makes sense to me, and then the last one, I guess, is just the convenience wrapper around the constructor call. No.
Yeah, that one. Let me look and see what we have for. That type right now. Yeah, so right now you can only create it from pieces. And yeah, so the constructor that takes asymmetric algorithm and the import subject public key info static, because this is a read-only type. It has no mutable members. Those are created from the data, or take the asymmetric algorithm, which already defines export subject public key info, and then it would take the thing, export it, and then call the import logically. So this is just make it easier to build this type.
I see now. I see it. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so the constructor makes sense. The try export and the export makes sense. The import one seems odd.
Right. So on things like RSA, we have import subject public key info, which is go build yourself from the data format you exported. This one is static because the public key class is not otherwise mutable. So right now it gets built and then it represents data and you can't modify it.
So where does the import go then?
Well, it's the fact that it says static void meant static public key.
Oh,
so
I see.
It's a named constructor.
Okay, now I get it. Because I'm like, I was thinking like, where does the data go? Like, I don't get it. Okay.
Yes, I think this is, hey, this needs to be static, and the word static got slapped on, and then it didn't gain its return type. But yes, it should say static public key.
So should we say create somewhere in the name then? Or is import the pattern that you use?
I mean, for the rest of our things, it's called import, but they're mutating methods. We could call this create from subject public key info. It's really long, but who cares?
Yeah, that's probably true. Create from subject public key info. Yeah. I guess
funny.
you have
Barry
to
wanted to call this method like a week ago.
And we think only taking span is fine here?
Yeah.
Do we need VB to use this method ever?
Probably not.
Yeah, there's probably 4 people in the world who use this time.
I love your level of confidence here, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, what's the VB concern?
It's the typical thing of like implicit, like span, right? Because you have to get a span from somewhere first.
Right, but that was F#, not VB.
Well, the F# one was the implicit conversion one, right? But like, I guess you can pass an array in, right? Yeah, it would be more an F# concern than a VB concern. That's true.
I thought VB couldn't create span.
Yeah, but you would create an array and you would pass that in. So the only thing that VB has to support is the implicit conversion to read-only span.
Does it support that today?
It should, because it supports generic user-defined conversions.
Oh, I thought the problem was with supporting refstruct because the obsolete keyword.
Yeah, there's something of like it can
see.
can work as long as you're not working with it. Like it can understand it needs to pass the thing through, and as long as it doesn't talk about it, everything's hunky dory. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
I mean, we can add the byte array overload. We don't have that for the import subject public key info on the asymmetric algorithm types.
Yeah, I'm also fine with saying screw it unless somebody complains when we're doing it. This is not an API that we expect more than 10 people in the world to use. Why am I wrong? Is that a mainline API we expect people to use?
I don't expect it to be very common, no. The public key class isn't used as an exchange type for very many things. It's a very limited thing, but places like our certificate creation API will accept one, and so it does have utility to make it a little easier to build. But yeah, the people who would use these methods are I'm not looking at YouTube, but I'm sure Kevin's on the call. And Levi's here, and I'm here, and I think Barry's off today. And that's pretty much everyone in the world who's going to use this.
Kevin is literally the last person who commented on YouTube, and it says, oops. So here you go.
So.
Hi, Kevin. You can't see, but I'm waving.
So yeah, I think we're covered.
Sounds good. Then one more down. Cool. Tell me more.
All right. So, on the subject of subject public key info, for EC Diffie-Hellman, for reasons that I don't understand, but I didn't build it, I just inherited it. We have a separate type called EC Diffie-Hellman public key. You can't build them. You can only get them built by an EC Diffie-Hellman. But the public key class here can't export itself as a subject public key info. You have to have kept around its parent, which it won't give you for layering and encapsulation reasons. So this is just add the same export subject public key info and try export subject public key info that all the asymmetric algorithm types have.
So what is the... So it's virtual, so I assume we have an implementation that does something meaningful in the base without people overriding it?
It's well, it's virtual because we can't make it abstract. And
yes.
I don't
throwing them?
think we can do anything other than throw in the base one because it literally has no data.
But I assume it's kind of one of those fake hierarchies where realistically the only implementations that matter are the ones we ship.
Yeah, so the only way you can ever get one of these is you have an instance of EC Diffie-Hellman and you access its public key property, which shouldn't have been a property because it's a factory instead of give you a shared reference, but still. So you call that property and it gives you the appropriately derived type for the native layer that you're working with at the time, and then those will just all implement these. So you have to co-implement EC Diffie-Hellman and EC Diffie-Hellman public key. When you derive one, you have to derive the other.
Yeah. By the way, there are existing virtual non-abstract methods on this type, and their default implementations all throw not implemented exception. So this would follow the same pattern.
Yeah, and if we're ready to talk about your derived type should override attribute, then these would get that.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are going to be virtual throw not supported exception.
Yeah, I mean, throwing not supported exception is obviously sad, but it, like Jeremy said, it's unlikely that anyone will ever encounter it, and it already follows the established pattern on this type.
Yeah, I mean, generally fine with like cases where 99% of the implementations are provided by the platform, because then we can do it at the same time. It's a bit more shitty when you have an open-ended ecosystem, because then you have this landmine problem, right? When people are, they don't want to call the new API because, well, it always blows up.
Yeah, it's effectively a closed virtual. No one should ever see the throw. Or it's a closed open hierarchy, as in we provide all the implementations and no one else ever has, to my knowledge.
I like closed open hierarchies. All right. Somehow I can't move my mouse again. All right, so who marked this for ready for review? Me. Yeah, that's awesome. In 2019. Oh, that's sad.
What, you don't remember what you did 7 months ago?
I also like this part here. I mean, we are only 7 months late to that promise, and it's not even Tuesday.
Well, I'm guessing that we just didn't have quorum a week later, and then
we lost track of it. Yeah.
Then yeah.
That one, yeah. So let me try to page context back in here. Oh yeah, I remember. Like, yeah, I added a bunch of questions because I didn't quite know what it was. So, bottom line is, it's some esoteric C++ thing that has nothing to do with .NET, because the way stuff works in our world is very different from the way it works in C++ land. So, they actually ship things that are namespaces. We don't, right? In our world, namespaces are just pure prefixes of type names. But that's not how C++ works, and so they need a way to actually mark things as namespaces, and that's what this attribute allows them to do. Oopsie.
Why do we need a .NET type to annotate members ported to? I guess this is for C++ CLI.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which we support on core now for Windows.
And I mean, I'm just curious, and maybe you don't know the answer. Given that C++ CLI is 20 years old, why do they just now need this?
Yeah, I think I asked that. Let me.
I can talk about it. So basically, like, they are, catching up with the C++ standard, right? So they are implementing the C++ 2020 or whatever is the current one, and they share a lot of code, in particular for the C runtime, between the managed C++ CLI and the regular product, right? And because of, and basically they want to be using the new C++ features in that shared piece too. And if the C++ CLI doesn't support them, they basically cannot use them, and the code doesn't look as pretty and so on. Like one question I would ask for this one is whether they still need it, because this was one of the options they to make this happen. I think they were also looking at other options, just emit the local copy of the attribute and don't, without requiring it in a public surface. So I think that's something to double check whether it's still required. But if they believe it's still required, I think it's kind of no-brainer to take. It's just support them.
So the reason they need it now is an interaction between C++ CLI and a newer C++ standard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they are basically building the C++ CLI compiler from the live code base. If it was like frozen code base that's not evolving, they wouldn't need it, right? So.
Yeah, makes sense. So then I would say, like, let me just point this out in the comment, but let's approve it. And so then basically the action item on them is they either do it, or they just close the issue as we don't need it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, unless they were planning on making whatever feature set needs to interact with this be Net5 only, they would either need this to be somewhere published in a net standard ref, or they would need to do they'll embed the attribute when they need it, at which point maybe we don't need the public one.
Right.
But it looks I guess because namespaces can't have attributes, so I guess assembly is the only place you can put it.
Yeah.
So yeah, if that's the definition they need, then seems fine to me if they need it.
Exactly. All right, so then let's call this one done. Connections, abstractions, I think there's just a meeting we need for this one. I need to schedule this because this one is a little bit too big for us to discuss.
We also don't have the right people on the call.
Oh, this has never stopped us. All right. Anybody any context on this one?
Looks. Who marked it ready?
It looks like Carlos did actually.
Because it seems like this is probably going to be a
No, Steven marked it, sorry.
big one. I don't know. The shared screen ends with the words proposed API, so I can't see how.
Yeah,
big
it's
the
not
proposed
that. I mean, it's basically just a new type, right? So it's not terrible. I mean, it inherits one of our most favorite types in the framework, where it's almost impossible to derive it and have things work. I mean,
on its face, the scenario sounds reasonable. Like I don't know what settings are available in zlib compressed stream, so I don't know if the compression level abstraction makes sense for us. Like, do we need to add another zlib specific parameter here? Just someone needs to research it.
I mean, that's kind of my concern too, is because we already screwed ourselves somewhat with deflate, because deflate has very specific levels, and you can't. I think we added APIs later to allow you to express the actual level, because we coerced it into this enum that we have. Or we added an enum member. Like, there was something we did recently in order to accommodate that. I mean, if you look at zlib stream the way I propose it, it doesn't actually define any APIs, right? The only one that it defines is base stream. Everything else are overrides, so I don't care realistically. So it really boils down to the constructors and the type itself,
Right.
Which seems reasonable.
And then for the constructors, I'd say probably we should just default the leave open parameter and collapse it down to the two constructors.
Yeah, I'd be up for that. Yeah, it just mirrors deflate streams constructor, so it's compression level, and mode with an optional boolean effectively.
Is this slated for 5.0? Because it was milestone was 5.0.
It was, I think that's what Steven marked it, I think, as milestone 5.0.
Like a week ago, or like
22 days ago. 3 weeks ago. So there's a bug apparently that needs to be fixed in some way for .NET 5, implementing this the right way to fix it. So it seems like.
So it's blocking.
Well, I think it's the work is being done. Is it public API?
Well, what's the bug? The HTTP client doesn't decompress deflate correctly. That's.
I mean, if deflate stream is not properly handling deflate, that seems like a bug.
I was about to say, like, I'm somewhat confused that how does zlib help with that?
Yeah.
Reading through the description here, it sounds like the data format is ever so slightly different. There's a different magic header.
Right. So is this a problem that HTTP client assumes that deflate and zlib in a header are compatible, or is this because it says here content encoding deflate. So if this is deflate and it's legal as deflate, then it seems like we would just have a bug in deflate stream. But it did say that on the acceptable encodings that zlib was one of them. Yeah, the only other question I would really have is, which I think is covered by that example header up top, is zlib the name of the data format or just the name of the library? And if it is the name of the data format, then it's an acceptable name. But if gzip is the name, then we shouldn't call it zlib.
Okay, so the way I understand it now is that it seems a header mismatch more than anything. And so I think the proposal is that zlib stream would effectively wrap deflate stream and literally just extract the header.
Or, depending on the mode, write the header.
Right. I mean, Stephen is sure that's the right behavior, or that's the right way to fix it. Maybe it's just me, but I feel more like what was said earlier is like, why can't we do this transparently in deflate stream directly? I guess reading should be transparent, right? Writing would probably require opt-out.
It's possible that our deflate stream is failing because it sees the header and doesn't think that's a legal start.
Yeah, but that one you could handle by just saying, well, if it's the magic header, then I just ignore it. But that wouldn't work for write because you would have to know whether you're supposed to write it or not. But I guess,
right.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's actually more work to make the constructors do the right things, because then you have a fairly non-trivial constructor configuration. Maybe using a different type actually is easier than that. Yeah, I mean, I'm personally fine with that, I guess. Having convinced myself that that might be the best model to do it. Anybody else?
I'm totally fine with adding this API. The timing surprised me a bit on it, but sure.
Well, at this point, it's also like, improving is independent of this, right?
Right.
Yeah. True.
If it fits, it fits.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the implementation of gzip stream, and it looks like it just always defers to deflate. I don't see where it actually does any extra work, but maybe I'm just not smart enough to read code.
Yeah, there's a decent amount of indirection in that code base.
Oh, it uses a private constructor of on deflate stream of telling it it's gzip. Okay. Yeah, so my only question was going to be, if zlib is deflate but with a header, should it extend deflate? But with gzip stream, we didn't do that, so I guess no.
Sorry, what is the gzip example?
So Steve had as a comment of what we would do in zlib stream, which is the same we did in gzip stream of it defers to deflate stream, but does the header work? So I looked, our existing gzip stream just extends stream directly. It does not extend deflate stream.
Interesting.
And I was going to ask if this should extend deflate stream.
So what you're saying is that zlib and gzip are both different versions of deflate? Or variants of deflate? And they just differ by header? Okay, then in that case, I am even more convinced that's the right fix, if that's even possible.
Yeah, so I have no idea what the implementation will look like on this, but the public surface area of effectively adding the 4 or 2 constructors and then overrides as necessary seem I guess base stream is the only potential difference, and that was done on. Again, it's weird. Deflate stream exposes base stream, so gzip stream exposes base stream, and now this exposes base stream, and it makes me wonder why we don't have a inheritance hierarchy here, but we're matching the pattern, and Steve's not here to explain. So
Yeah. Let me
Well,
find.
we could always introduce an intermediate type in the future if we wanted to. That's not a breaking change.
Yeah, but for one property, it seems a bit weird, right?
Sure.
I mean, if we already have the property, we'd have to define it as new, I think,
Yes.
because none of them are virtual, and
No, that's safe.
we're
right?
torn on whether or not we can make something virtual late in the game, and there would be the runtime handles most of these things. The language or the C# compiler no longer is as reliable as we want it to be. They started doing optimizations. Dumb code is better.
Curse us for asking them for new features.
All right. Oh, here we go. Comparable for Rune. Levi, that's your
Yeah.
thing.
This was pretty easy. We implemented comparable of t, but forgot to implement comparable at the same time. It makes it harder to consume from other languages. Like I think F# was the one that was called out here. Yeah.
Interesting. How does that how does this impact language interrupt?
I don't quite understand, but if you read the thread, there was a demonstration of the kinds of problems it caused. But regardless, like it really should be best practice for us anyway. If we implement enumerable of t or comparable of t, we also should implement the non-generic one as well.
Oh,
Well, for
I
enumerable,
see
that's
now.
required.
Sorry, not enumerable. equatable.
So
I mean,
this-
you say it's the best practice, but it's not in the book.
Well, there's no non-generic equatable, right? That's called
because you
object,
have dot equals. Yeah.
because it's already an object, right?
Yeah. Maybe I'm thinking equality compare then.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean that makes sense. I mean, like, I think I understand now where the F# thing comes from, because F# has this structured equality comparison thing, and the problem is if you need basically some way to walk a graph, and if things are generic, that apparently that you can't plumb the type through in all cases, and so that's basically why they needed a non-generic interface to do that.
Yeah, I guess I'll start taking notes for rules that we need to write down for the next version of the book.
I mean, that one seems like an analyzer should just do the right thing. It's like if you implement comparable of t, you should also implement comparable. Like, that seems pretty straightforward to write as a rule, or as a analyzer for that matter.
Yeah. Does anyone know why we didn't Does anyone know why the generic interface doesn't extend the non-generic interface? I know we can't do it now, but
Quite frankly, I think we just fucked up.
okay. Because I assume enumerable, the only reason people added that relationship was so that for each worked.
Yeah. And that's exactly it, right? Like, the language kind of forced it, right?
You know, my guess would be that, you know, at the time when the generic interfaces and collections were introduced, the thinking was that the non-generic funds will become kind of legacy obsolete and they will disappear. So, you know, that might have been the reason why kind of the generic world is separate. So
Yeah, I guess I don't know what we do for non-generic comparable when the object is not of the input type. Is that negative and I mean, is that throw?
We can look at what int and long and other types do and just follow the established pattern there. But yeah, I wouldn't want to force arbitrary third-party code to implement to implement regular compare to if they're implementing the comparable of T interface. But because this is an exchange type, we should do both, just to make the ecosystem happier.
Yeah, looking at some random implementations of it, it looks like people throw argument exception for you're not the type I expected you to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, it looks like a lot of these also special case null and say that null compares as less than everything.
I mean, that's kind of standard practice, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you kind of need that because if you sort a list like a table, you'll have null properties in there, and you want some same behavior.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, so then let's do this. Expose transaction safe points. I think we need somebody from the data team to talk about that. Do not use out strings for p invokes.
Analyzer.
Oh, that's right. Now we're in the analyzer territory. Let me open the other related ones. So I think there was a lot of discussion on this one, right? I think I read it yesterday. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, I don't have a concern with this one or the other. I mean, Jan probably has opinions on this.
Yeah, like I don't even remember what the attribute does. So.
We have seen several bugs or issues related to this pattern because it doesn't do what people expected that it will do. So.
But is that specific to string, or is it generally like every time you have effectively an object? But I guess the only object we support is string or string builder, right?
It's specific to string. Basically, like the way the invoke marshalling does, it has like basically a black box that takes a type and all the annotations on it, and it will tell you this is how it will be marshaled, and the answer that the black box is giving for this ref string out isn't isn't intuitive.
Yeah. So is string builder equally problematic, or is it okay?
I would expect string builder not have the same problem.
Okay. And while the proposal talked about undecorated input strings and ref strings, both with the out parameter, it didn't say what it means if it's bad to have out on out string. I assume it's just redundant. Yeah, seems like a reasonable analyzer. I'm by default net 5.
Yes. To be honest, I'm surprised that the marshaller doesn't just fail the call site. But sure.
I feel like that is that this issue that in the middle it says they added that as a feature in 5, that the marshaller would just fail on this now. I think one of the things was an analyzer of the marshaller is going to yell at you anyway, if you actually ever call the method.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. So this is an analyzer to tell you the marshaller is going to throw when it gets here. It's nicer because you don't find out that you only hit this path in obscure cases. So yeah. ship it.
And the fixer would say use a proper out string instead of just attributing the string itself with out.
I don't know that there's a fixer. Maybe you didn't. Maybe the answer is remove the attribute.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I mean, don't hold it like that.
So then this one was the string. Marshalling a string builder is more expensive than people want it to be, and so this is a performance suggestion.
Yeah.
Not a on by default thing. So
I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure I buy the off by default situation a lot, but like it seems to me if you think something is super noisy that it's off by default and very fringy in nature, I'm not sure it's worthwhile building in the first place. But if the team feels super strong that we should ship this, I'm not, throwing a fit, but it seems to me like we'd probably invest resources elsewhere if we feel that strongly about it not being on by default.
Maybe. I mean, it's definitely a thing of if you're looking for, if you care about writing hyper performance code, right? You're willing to write 100 lines of code to do what one line could do because it's 10% faster, then you would turn this on. But an average person may not care. So this is do you want something to like this Marshall is easy. The alternative is expensive. The alternative takes a lot more code.
Yeah, the alternative has a very steep learning curve, and I commented on that in this issue as well.
So this wouldn't be a, hey, you did a p-invoke with a string builder. Did you know you're doing it wrong? Because that certainly shouldn't be a warning. It could maybe be IDE suggestion, but it certainly shouldn't be a warning.
Yeah, I mean, I think off by default, and then when you turn off becoming a warning, I guess makes more sense than IDE suggestion, because IDE suggestion is just, where issues go to die, because there's this very long list of things. So you're not very likely to see this, right? If you write high performance code, you probably get warnings for using var everywhere or something, right?
So I feel that like this would be if you were doing something and you were either working on your performance or hyper performance was a goal.
Right.
You would go to the analyzer settings, you would enable the entire performance category, and then you would fix everything it suggested at you.
Right.
So this makes sense to have in the set of things we can tell you that you have a mild performance trap.
So, and actually, maybe Tanner or Jan would know the answer to this. Why can't the marshaller just do the fast thing on your behalf? Because what the marshaller is doing is it's getting a buffer, copying the string builder into it, and then passing the buffer down to the p-invoke. Like,
yeah, okay. I think the buffer, the marshaller basically does that already. Maybe it's not as efficient as it can be, but the problem is basically the extra copy, the extra, it's still like, I think basically what this analyzer is really telling you is don't use string builder at all, right? The using the string builder inside the invoke signature is just tip of the iceberg, right?
Well, is the marshaller using rented memory for this? Or sorry, is it using something that's going to cause a GC collect to need to happen, or is it using?
I don't think the marshals allocate on GC heap. I think they allocate on stack and or using kind of malloc free.
Yeah, so I think Jan's right. I think the marshaller uses its own native memory functions, but that does raise an interesting question where if the analyzer is telling you don't pass in string builder, like turn the string builder into a rented char array and then pass down the rented char array, like again, that's something the marshaller could do on your behalf.
Well,
if
but
what the analyzer is instead telling you is don't use string builder at all anywhere in the outer code path, that requires major restructuring on the part of the caller.
yeah.
Right, and that kind of restructuring we have done to fix these warnings in our, in .NET Runtime libraries. Like when we are fixing the string builder marshalling, performance issues. It wasn't just like local change. Oh, like really string builder everywhere and just do like local tweak. It was always like non-trivial refactoring of the code.
Yeah, because I looked at it as I thought it was saying effectively the marshaller is, roughly speaking, just calling string builder.toString and passing that. So it makes a copy, it throws it away. You pass the same one to another p invoke. It makes another copy, throws it away, and then it has GC concerns. If this is telling you, hey, instead you want to rent or use a rented managed buffer instead of letting us do malloc and free in the runtime, that doesn't feel like it's actually buying anything.
Well, it not only does it marshal it too, it also marshals back. So it creates a character array. It copies the contents of the string builder into that array. It passes that new array into native land. Native land does everything. And then depending on the in-out attributes you have, I don't remember what the default is, it may take that array and copy its contents back into the string builder you originally passed in, so that any mutations are preserved.
Okay, so probably what it's saying the concern is the copy back, because it has to blow away all the contents of your string builder.
Well, there's just multiple layers of perf overhead, and if you're just using something like span instead, you can avoid the copy to and copy from, and you can just split the pointer to index 0 directly, and avoid all of the additional allocations and copy overhead, and all of those add up.
Fair enough. But yeah. It got a green light, so we can move on.
All right, so then here's the last one for the analyzers for marshalling. I think one of the suggestions was that we could ship a database that syncs with the SDK, so we know actually whether the names are valid or match the casing, I guess, or spelling for that matter.
I mean, the analyzer should really also look at the entry point name instead of just the extern name. But yeah, I mean, if we take a database of all the like Windows API sets and say this is a known name, then that seems reasonable.
Is API set still a thing, or did Windows move away from those?
Well, whatever.
Yeah, it's not the API sets really that are a concern. It's just the names of the entry points, which are always well known. The names of the entry points don't change based on what the API set is.
Right, but like you would have to look at the entry point to say, is this an actual DLL that we know about, right?
So today most of the Win32 APIs have a docs page, and on that docs page it explicitly lists whether you need get last error, need to call get last error, and also the library it's exported from, and alternative names it might be available under. I actually have a tool that I use for my own Windows interop bindings that queries against a local copy of that docs repo to validate that my own bindings are correct.
Yeah, so I think that was Jan's suggestions that we could literally have that produced at some point and then literally just ship it with the analyzer, right?
Yep.
I mean,
you could presumably do the same for something like POSIX or any other well-known library.
Yeah, but I don't know that we do name mangling on those. This is use the right name and set exact spelling to true so that the p invoke binder doesn't have to search.
Right. And the search is actually expensive enough where it shows up in real performance profiles.
It is not. It's basically like, a hash table lookup in a sense. So and the way the search is set up, it tends to succeed on the first try. So this is kind of a micro optimization. So.
Yeah, I guess it also depends on how we want to structure the analyzer, right? I mean, like, there's like two concerns. One of them is just we waste time because we don't have the spelling exactly. And the other one is, well, the thing you have defined doesn't actually exist as far as we know. So you have a typo somewhere, right? And they're kind of complementary. So I think in general, like, it seems fine to me to approve this and then, refine this.
I think maybe more interesting or a complementary feature to this one would be introduce new flag somewhere in the DL import attribute. I'm not sure whether there's a free flag that we can use, but hopefully there is. And that will basically say, or actually it's the exact spelling. No, forget it.
Yeah, exact spelling only has meaning on Windows, right? We don't have a suffix searcher on other OSs.
No, we used to have, and it was a bug, and we just turn it off so it wasn't necessary.
And we don't do any prefix matching for underscore on Unix, which is a common convention.
No,
okay.
on Unix, basically you just call this DL sim and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a micro optimization because I assume that once the binder finds the name, it's bound the stub and it doesn't search again.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So this is a startup code path optimization.
All right, then let's just.
So the concept is reasonable. I don't know that we would ever commit to it.
All right, two more, and then we have 5.0 done.
All right, so when we added async dispose, CryptoStream gained a dispose async, and as part of implementing that, Steve actually implemented a method called flush final block async, which was the async version of flush final block, but it isn't public. And the synchronous version is public. So this is, hey, can you make the asynchronous version public? Instead of just requiring, or instead of the only way of doing it is to call dispose async. Dispose async does more work than just this.
Right.
So if you scroll slightly, should just be flush final block async with a defaulted cancellation token. Yeah.
Okay, obvious question. Are you sure about value task?
That's what Steve's implementation of. So Steve has a internal implementation that he wrote as value task. So since this is just making it public and adding a cancellation token, yes.
Because Steven said so, right? That was the rule, right?
Right. Yes, this is the ultimate. It's obviously correct because we ran it through the Steve filter and it came back value task. I'm fine with saying regular task because I hate value task, but I went with Steve.
Right. Yeah, I'm impartial as to which of the two. The return value aside, the API looks fine.
And so you would basically use this if you already do async, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's very little reason ever to need to call this method synchronous or asynchronous, but people do. And Generally, it means they want to do work and they're still inside the using and they're waiting on the last thing to happen and they're not willing to just wait until the using terminates, but sure.
Yeah, I've done this before. Not in this case, but like
Yeah,
writing to
crypto
memory
is a-
stream or something, right? And then trying to read it back.
It's a
Um,
special type.
All right, so then let's just do this, and then we're done for this one as well.
Yeah, having it as value task also means that it's easier to call from the dispose method. So I think that's one of the reasons he did it.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah.
That's why the internal one's value task. The outer one could certainly auto wrap, but
Yeah.
Sure. All right, so then we have this one here. I saw Jeremy's response, but I didn't actually read it, so I wanted to surprise
So-
myself.
yeah, on email, I pointed out that at the bottom of this issue, Jared says it seems that this ultimately needs to be a compiler feature, not a language feature, but a compiler feature, instead of an analyzer, because F# doesn't have analyzers. I pointed out in an email that if it's a compiler feature, it may mean that VB doesn't get it, because I don't know what our tolerance of adding features to VB is. So maybe the answer is it should be both, but or
So-
that we just do it as an analyzer and hope one of these days F# gets on board the analyzer string.
So I have to say I don't buy Jared's argument, and let me explain why. So basically what Jared is saying, because you can't enforce it, you would have to solve it at the compiler layers, and you have to solve it for all three languages. But I don't think that's what this thing is for. It's not about enforcing. It's just saying if you have a language that honors this property either via a third-party analyzer framework or because the compiler natively understands the attribute, you get effectively an information that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten, right? So like basically, we would still keep designing our BCL, assuming that people will not have overridden those methods, right? Because it's just a suggestion. People should be overriding those. So that means we still have to ship an actual physical implementation that does something sensible, and sensible sometimes means throwing because there is no actual implementation you could provide. But if people actually derive from the type, we want them very strongly to override these methods. And so all we would do is you would just change the IDE to just generate that code, right? And I would argue that doesn't even require compiler work, because you could imagine a world where if you do control dot on a type and you derive from it in VB, whatever code splits the IDE does for that can totally honor that property, right? And it can just basically emit the overrides for these methods, right? That doesn't require compiler work. It's just IDE work. And so could F#, right? I mean, I'm not sure F# has a control dot implement kind of thing, but if they did, they could do the same thing, right? So like this is more of a framework author kind of like power tweak, so that when people override these things, they get better behavior out of the box. But it's not meant to be, oh my God, we have an actual way to tell people like you need to override this method and then enforce it or something, right?
Right. I mean, because no matter what, you would get the thing of we added a thing in net 5 on a type that's also in net standard, and net standard can't override it because
Right.
they wouldn't even see the ref for it. They don't even see the virtual. So
Yes, and so that's why I think I'm totally fine with these soft things being, custom attributes, and then the IDE is just a little bit smarter about them. That to me seems like the best compromise. Right? I can't see us doing anything in the runtime. I can't see us doing anything in the compiler layer for these things. It's just, it's a constraint when you ship.
that's fair.
I think that's why.
Yeah, my comment over email was I wasn't comfortable approving it over email because it ended with contention instead of ended with consensus.
Yeah.
So, but no, those all seem like reasonable arguments to me. And I think I looked at the attribute targets, and those are the only things that can be virtual. So that looks like the right attribute usage to me. And then the analyzer would be if the most derived virtual for a particular virtual slot has this attribute, then it warns that you should be overriding it, right? So channel reader says should be overridden, and if you extended something that derived from channel reader that did provide the implementation, then you don't do it.
Yes.
But if the derived type is like, hey, I did something in the middle that you need to fix this now, they could add the override should be overwritten defers to the base class. But they're telling you like you really ought to do something in a derived type better than I did. Or do you think that the analyzer should only support it at the virtual root and not on overrides?
Yeah, I think only looking at the most derived one makes sense, because otherwise you make a lot of assumptions, right? Like it doesn't generally make sense for the people, one step derived, no pun intended, to actually handle it, because you don't know what the base is supposed to do, right? Like that's kind of an implementation detail, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the two obvious answers are most derived for your base class and the virtual root. And I think I would go with most derived.
Yeah.
So yeah, as long as I think it makes sense for an IDE feature could do this with or without compiler support. A compiler could be taught to warn if people really want that feature, and also maybe one of these days F# will participate with analyzers.
I mean, F# could do the thing in the middle, right? As I said, I mean, maybe they don't have an analyzer, but maybe when you do control dot implement things that just generate the stubs, right? I mean, that would be still adding value.
Right. The IDE, whether it's VS or a VS extension or writer or whatever, could look at the attribute and change the auto-generate stubs.
Is there a proposed list of types beyond just channel reader whose members might get this attribute? Presumably EC diffie Hellman public key get subject public key info would be one of them.
Yeah, so I guess the follow-up would be, if we approve the attribute now, do we want to try for RCs in 5 to paint at least some applicable methods, which would be, I know in crypto we have a bunch of things that the base class throws not supported exception with the message derived types must implement this, and those would all get this attribute.
I mean, that would be something we could probably easily track, right? I wouldn't even necessarily look at things we introduced in this release. I would probably just do a blind scan for virtual methods and abstract types whose body throws not supported, and then just review those, because I'm pretty sure we have a lot of them.
Yeah, because we generally, and this was mentioned earlier, but generally we fall into one of two buckets, right? You have to implement this in order for the functionality to even work, or something like Stream where you should implement this, or else your consumers are going to be in for a bad time.
Yeah. Do we want to make a distinction?
I think it's useful for there to be a distinction, because maybe I don't care about overriding, write async, because it works, it's just not optimal.
I mean, I guess that's kind of the thing we have to, like, when we actually walk the list, we probably find some categories where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense. But I don't know, things that generally work, I probably wouldn't necessarily flag them, because then you drown the people. On the other hand, the only person that you are flagging are people that derive from these types, which is probably a much smaller set to begin with. But I will also say that depending on what type you're looking at, if I derive from Stream, chances are I probably do it in a unit test or some other thing on the side where I don't care about perf. I just want to intercept some data, do some extra thing around it, and I'm fine with it, right? And if you make me override 20 methods, I'm going to be very unhappy about that.
So do we want should be overridden for this is a non-functional implementation, and then like non-optimal implementation for because that would be the stream where because anything that we added a span or memory overload of, like, this is actually, if we made it work, it's worse than calling the array one if you hit this base virtual, because we have to take the span, which may have been from an array, copy it to an array or a new array, and then call the other thing, and because of which one was defined first. So we can do one attribute for the both or define two. Really, this is sort of you as the user experience for the team.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem with this is we would have to do it at the attribute level, right? Whoever applies it has to make that decision.
Right. I mean, maybe should be overridden has a optional property describing if it's that the implementation is non-functional or just bad?
Maybe we should do that way around. Maybe we should just, instead of saying should be overridden, we should describe what it does. Like basically saying, you know, less optimal base implementation, throws equals true versus throws equals false. And then the analyzer can handle that and say you should override this guy.
Well, because for something here like channel reader, the decision was just make the feature say it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it functions, it's just probably not what you want.
Yeah, this one is an interesting candidate, right? Because it's, I mean, it doesn't throw, but it basically never works, right? So you basically have a non-functional behavior in this case. You're basically missing feature versus the async one, it works, it's just slow. Or maybe slow is the wrong word, but maybe doesn't actually do it synchronously or might cause a deadlock or something like that, right? That's, yeah, I guess, yeah, let me think about this. Let me actually flip this back to needs work and say we're generally happy with that, but like we should think about how we handle perf or less optimal versus throwing.
For things like can peek, if it's a non-functional feature, then presumably we could also make the IDE smart enough when you right-click implement abstract class, it would also give you overrides for those. Because right now it only does abstracts, right?
Yeah, well, that's what the whole thing would be, is this attribute that we're telling implement abstract member to like go find all the things you should be doing in addition to all the ones that you have to do, and which would be a discussion Emo gets to have with the VS team.
Oh yeah. I didn't realize that was able to be influenced by an analyzer.
I mean, the analyzer would maybe just be an independent vector of the same semantic, but
sure.
So the question is really, what level of granularity and categorization do we want on these things? Of this is going to throw, this is a optional feature that is disabled, this is a very bad implementation, please give me a better one, but it works. Those are the three that we've talked about on this call already.
Yeah, so you could.
HTTP client has some features too that are enabled through additional overloads. It would be great to be able to say like the other one is soft obsoleted and go overload this new method instead.
Yeah, you could imagine that if the analyzer does influence what right-click implement abstract class does, then you could imagine that some of the methods have a default body of throw new not implement exception, and some methods have a default body of return based on whatever, based on this attribute's flags somehow. Does that kind of make sense? Like it's there in your code when you subclass it so that you should be doing something, but the default implementation, air quotes, works.
Yeah, I mean, the specific generated code, I think, would be fungible. Certainly, if we have the granularity that allows us to express that, then that would be good. So maybe it means that Emo needs to have a chat with whoever owns CodeGen.
By CodeGen, you mean the
thing that fills in that says, oh, you're a non-abstract type extending an abstract type. I'm going to go add all the missing members for you. Whoever does that for VS.
Yeah. I mean, that would be the IDE team, right? Which is kind of like Cyrus and friends. I mean, like the, yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm kind of concerned about like us not being able to declaratively indicate these different cases. Because this might lead us down to maybe we don't have an attribute, maybe we literally just have a base analyzer that we can derive from the SDK that does the work, and then we can differentiate there by just generating different diagnostic IDs.
Yeah, but I mean, presumably we don't want we want something that we can paint in the code base instead of maintaining a list of methods in the analyzer. So we would need the granularity to be expressible in the
that's
in the
also
metadata.
fair. I mean, you could imagine we could just cheat, right? We could just say, screw it. The only thing we have is if a generic analyzer, and then Actually, that's a good question. I'm not sure we can actually do this. Like one thing we could do is just having diagnostic string attribute. That's that diagnostic ID string that we pass to the attribute. But I'm not sure that actually works because the problem is the analyzer has to declare upfront what diagnostic IDs it can produce. And we didn't have to do this for the obsolete one because that's special to the compiler. So the compiler doesn't have to do that.
Right. I mean, like there could be a thing of you make should be overridden attribute and then either in a nested or a sibling enum describing, of the Y and that it defaults or when or whatever, right? So then it would be like when performance, when optional feature, when always. So the throwy ones would be always override this. And then that enum describes the few simple relationships we have, and the default would be always. So you could just say should override, and it's just like, yep, this should be overridden. And then you're like, oh, should override performance. Of like, oh, if you care about performance-y things, then I'll issue this as a performance category diagnostic, and you can turn off performance category diagnostics. So so I think an enum property on this would be reasonable. Let
me chew on this a little bit, but I think that's also where I'm heading right now. Is like a kind or something, right?
Yeah. And then the code generator could look at the kind, the analyzer could look at the kind for changing the diagnostic ID, and whether it's on by default or not. Because I assume that we would take the ones of, hey, this member always throws, you really, really, really want to override it, and that one would be a on by default with the TFM.
Right.
Like that it would start being a new. I guess really we don't even need to TFM lock it. Would we backport this attribute? Like would we shove it in a net standard bucket somewhere?
Unlikely. I mean, I could imagine a case where we would ship it with the library, similar to what we do with the platform one.
Maybe. That means that they also have to carry the enum with them.
Yeah, that would be the shitty thing. But that seems like something that the only party that is very likely to do that is us. So I'm kind of okay with that.
Yeah, I'm not saying we should put it in like netstandard.dll. I'm just asking, would we put this in a package somewhere that has a net standard target so that people could apply this to existing net standard targeting libraries?
Yeah, like, I mean, I would generally say for attributes, we generally don't do that. We generally just tell them, like, define it yourself as an internal one. That's usually what we have done so far. I'm actually not sure what we did. Did we ever ship the one for the nullable ones? I don't think we did, right?
I don't know. If only there was a website that would tell us this.
Yeah. If only that would be up to date, though.
That's true. I see it as...
I don't think we did, right?
Only net standard 2.1.
Yeah,
so we did. I'm looking at maybe null, because the easy ones, right? The question mark, the compiler will just splat that one for you. It's the complicated ones that.
Well, that one we went even a step further. For one we didn't even ship at all. Like it's always synthesized by the compiler.
Fair enough.
So like that's the other extreme. It's like you don't get to ever use it directly. All right, so then I think that's all we have for today. We're already 10 minutes over, but like we did good. We did good today.
Yeah, I think this is our most productive session we've had in a while.
So I
guess it's because all the hard things keep bubbling to the top.
So we're now down to 29. Yeah, so the only two things that I think are in the 5.0 milestone now, let me double check, but these are the connection abstractions and then the exposed transaction save points in ADO.NET. This one here. I will ping our friends in data, whether that's important to them.
Cool.
And then, Corey, you'd still want the connection abstraction scheduled, right?
Yes, please.
We'll do that. Awesome. Thanks, guys. And then I see you next week. Or Friday, right? Friday, I guess. All right.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye bye.
All right.